The Biden team can say, well, if things are so bad, how come the stock market's on a roll?
Because they think I'm going to be elected.
That you think the stock market's rallying because people think you're going to be elected?
Yeah.
You know, that makes no sense at all, right? That the stock market would be rallying in February because Donald Trump might be elected in November and take office almost a year from now. The Dow Jones had another record close today and had absolutely nothing to do with Donald Trump's wild imagination. Here's the Federal Reserve Chair, Jerome Powell, this week with his take on the economy.
This is a good situation. Let's be honest. This is a good economy.
There was even more evidence of that today in the blockbuster jobs report. The U.S. economy added 353,000 net new jobs last month. That's double the number that economists had predicted. Wages climbed to 4.5% year over year. That is higher than the 4.1% that was forecast. The unemployment rate held steady at 3.7%. The unemployment rate has now remained below 4% for 2 consecutive years. That is a remarkable and rare achievement. Today, President Biden tied the good economy to good policy, saying, quote, "It's great news for working families that wages, wealth, and jobs are higher now than before the pandemic, and I won't stop fighting to lower costs and build an economy from the middle out and the bottom up." As for Republicans who might not be listening to the White House, they could very well hear it from an unlikely news source.
If you own your home at a low fixed rate mortgage, 3%, and the value of your home is going up, that is wealth accumulation. And you have a fixed rate mortgage, you have a fixed payment every month, and your wages are increasing, that is extra spending money. That's how you benefit from inflation. And people are out spending. And the messaging from the RNC has been way off base.
Falling inflation and rising growth gives the U.S. the world's best recovery. Steve Forbes with me this morning. I think the Democrats are going to run with that headline. I mean, they're just going to plaster this all over the place. But are they right? Does America now have the best recovery?
Well, yes. We had a blowout jobs report, more than twice the consensus expectation. Now, I know many of my conservative friends are trying to drill holes in this report. But you know what, folks? It is what it is. It's a very strong report. Mea culpa, I was wrong about the slowdown in the recession.
Joining us now for a very short segment, because I don't know what work he's got to do, is Jared Bernstein, the chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Jared, they're doing your work for you over at Fox News. Usually someone can poke holes in these things, but they're doing it.
First of all, I want to say that it's very possible the stock market's up because they knew I was coming on your show tonight. Look,
while there's nonsense in the air, why not add more, right?
We heard a lot of honest assessments of what's a very strong economy right there, and I give kudos to folks who are recognizing that. I think it does get a little hard not to see when you've had unemployment below 4% for 2 years running. We haven't seen a streak like that since the 1960s. And, of course, the big job number today, 353,000, well above what was expected. It's not the first expectation-busting report we've seen in recent months and quarters. As you know, we had the same thing with GDP just a week or so ago. So the American economy continues to defy expectations as Bidenomics continues to grow the economy from, as the president said, the middle out, bottom up.
Let's talk about how this happens. You've got a situation in which we had inflation growing at a rate that was faster than wages. Now you've got wages outpacing inflation for several months now. And you've got low unemployment, you've got more job creation. So people start to feel that. And then they get these phone calls from pollsters or interviewers at the University of Michigan. And the consumer confidence numbers start to show confidence. And then people have to talk about it because people talk to one another about it. And they talk about it on Fox News. And then people realize that they've been hoodwinked a little bit. In reality, a year ago, there was some concern of a recession. And it was widespread. It wasn't weird conservative talking points. But now people are understanding that the talking points don't match the reality in the economy.
Exactly. We've had a real gap between the kind of economic indicators you and I were just talking about, which have been solid for a while now. I told you about the unemployment rate staying low for so long, but in fact, wages have been beating prices on a year-over-year basis for about 10 months now. That's a trend. That's not a blip, and it is now factoring into sentiment and consumer confidence surveys in a way that looks pretty reliable, and in some cases, using a word that one of the pollsters did today, we're seeing surges. So the University of Michigan survey, a widely watched indicator of sentiment, was up 13% in January and 14% in December, about 30% overall. That's a great jump. So we're seeing that in a couple of other indicators as well. It does seem like the gains to working families are starting to show up in sentiment about how the economy's doing.
I want to put up a Quinnipiac poll that talked about the most urgent issues facing the economy. Now, as you and I know, Jared, the economy is, generally speaking, always hangs around the number one or number two, but it's actually become the number two. And preserving democracy, according to this poll, is the most urgent issue facing the country today. Immigration is number three. That tends to be a concern more for people who identify as Republicans than Democrats. But talk to me about the democracy issue and how that affects the president and the things he talks about, because he's out there talking about the fact that the economy's fine and we can fix it and various people can run it. But democracy is something that actually might go away this very year.
Look, I'm an economist, but when I hear Joe Biden talk about preserving democracy with the urgency, the dedication, the passion that you hear from him on this issue, I think it's not only myself, but lots of people are very moved by that. It's obviously critically important to recognize that ranking that you just showed. Now, look, when it comes to the economy, we know we've got more work to do. We've made real progress. We're going to build on that progress. When it comes to preserving democracy, obviously that's one of the president's top priorities, and he will continue to push that from any corner where he sees that extremely valuable institution threatened.
Jared, good to see you as always. Thank you for joining us tonight. Jared Bernstein is the chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. All right, coming up, progressives in Texas are taking on Texas's all-Republican state Supreme Court. Texas Democrat Jasmine Crockett and Gina Ortiz-Jones will be to all of you. We're continuing our breaking news coverage of the United States launching its first airstrikes against Iranian and Iranian-backed forces in retaliation for the attack against U.S. forces in Jordan that killed 3 U.S. service members and injured dozens. According to the White House and Pentagon, U.S. military forces conducted strikes on 7 facilities in Iraq and Syria tonight that officials say Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and affiliated militias used to attack U.S. forces. The National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby told reporters that of the 7 facilities, 4 are in Syria and 3 are in Iraq. These videos appear to show one of those strikes earlier today in Anbar province in western Iraq. An Iraqi security official told NBC News that a U.S. airstrike targeted a weapons warehouse and 3 houses belonging to an Iran-backed militia group that has been sanctioned by the U.S. government. During the roughly 30-minute attack, U.S. Central Command said military forces hit over 85 targets at those locations with more than 125 precision munitions, including command and control centers, intelligence centers, and weapons facilities. The strikes began shortly after President Biden and the First Lady attended the dignified transfer of the 3 American soldiers killed in that drone strike. President Biden issued this statement saying, in part, "Our response began today. It will continue at times and places of our choosing. The United States does not seek conflict in the Middle East or anywhere else in the world, but let all those who might seek to do us harm know this: if you harm an American, we will respond," end quote. The Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, also made it clear that this is just the start of the U.S. response, with President Biden directing additional action, saying, quote, "The President and I will not tolerate attacks on American forces. We will take all necessary actions to defend the United States, our forces, and our interests," end quote. With that, NBC News senior White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell joins us now from the White House. Kelly, good evening to you. It has been a very, very active evening. It was projected that this would happen. The president and others in the administration had said there will be attacks and they will be scaled. They will be spaced out and scaled. Was tonight what you were expecting?
In many ways, yes. And we had been given a great deal of preview, and it came down to something as fundamental as the weather, making tonight an ideal time for the U.S. military to carry out these attacks. They don't always need cloudless conditions to do so, but in the conversation we had with senior officials after the attacks were complete in this first iteration, they did stress that weather was a factor. It also, of course, helps to assess the battle damage that's been done. And when daylight comes to that part of the world and they can do more assessment, that'll give us a more full picture of these strikes, what they accomplished, and what might be remaining to do in the ongoing work that we know is still to come. So part of what we can expect is that, as you described it, the 30 minutes of bombardment in key areas where officials say they took great care to choose areas without civilian collateral damage. That is not to say that there wouldn't have been deaths associated with this related to those directly involved in the kind of conduct that led to the attacks on the U.S. that prompted all of this, but carefully picking their targets. And that has been a process. The president had indicated he was prepared to take action, and then the military prepares a variety of options. Intelligence is influenced by that as well, of course, all the different kinds of components. What we saw tonight was, in many ways, a very predictable kind of military strike. One of the things we may not be able to see in the sort of pictures that you're playing to accompany our conversation would be if there's a cyber component. That's something that has been discussed but not explicitly previewed, or other things that they learn after they get some of the battlefield assessment information back, when they can see, were they able to degrade the capabilities that they wanted to, what other targets remain to be pursued. And the timing, of course, takes into account all of these things. And now that this first iteration has taken place, there has to be some contemplation of a response from the Iranian-influenced organizations that the U.S. is targeting here. When we spoke to officials earlier tonight, at that point, they said they saw no immediate signs of retaliation, but we expect that there could be some, and certainly there are some frustrations in the region that are exacerbated by this. And so one of the toughest jobs for the president here is to find that way to calibrate these strikes that they can degrade the capabilities to stop attacks on the U.S., but not go so far that it draws more conflict that would draw in the U.S.
That is a tough line to walk. It is now 6:05 a.m. in the region that has been hit. Sunrise is in 90 minutes from now. So as you said, somewhere after that, we will get an assessment of what the damage is on the ground, and that may determine what the response is from Iran or its proxies and what happens tomorrow night. Thank you, as always, Kelly. Good to see you. Kelly O'Donnell for us at the White House. NBC national security correspondent Dan DeLuce now joins us from the Pentagon. Dan, welcome. The calculus on this is very, very tricky. The last thing Joe Biden wants to get into is an expanded war, something that the Iranians have been sort of dangling, the idea of whether or not America can be dragged into a broader regional war. Tell me about how this works. How do you conduct 30 minutes worth of strikes with 105 munitions, send the necessary warning, and yet not escalate this into a regional war that involves Iran?
I think no one has the answer to that. It really is a dilemma, and it's also a case of one side sending a message and hoping that the other side, the adversary, interprets that message in the way it's intended. And of course, there are so many conflicts throughout history where adversaries send messages that are not interpreted in the way they're intended. So, for example, this is a case, as we know, where President Biden has been trying so hard to avoid exactly what came to pass today, right? And so once those U.S. troops were killed on Sunday, the Biden administration felt they had to respond. They had to draw a line and say, no more. You've now taken the lives of U.S. troops. We're going to send you a message. So it's not just about whatever damage was caused by these airstrikes, by hitting more than 85 targets. It's really, what is the impact on the calculus of Iran? And that is the big question now that we don't have an answer to. And how will the Iranian proxies that are armed and financed and trained by Iran, how are they going to respond? And I think the jury's out. It's only the first day. Keep in mind, we're going to see more airstrikes. This operation is not over. The defense secretary yesterday and today making very clear that this is just the start of the campaign. So we're going to see more airstrikes. But in terms of this calculus that you're asking about, I think it's very much a danger that Iran is not deterred, that Iran feels that its proxy network is doing exactly what it needs to do, pushing the envelope, putting pressure on Israel, putting pressure on the U.S., creating huge problems for the whole international community in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden by attacking those commercial ships. So I think the jury is still out how this is going to unfold, and even the White House isn't sure how this will play out.
Dan, you talked about the Iranian proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis in the Gulf of Aden and in Yemen. None of them were targeted tonight. In fact, our viewers will become familiar with the names of the groups that were targeted tonight, the Quds Force or the IRGC. The IRGC is the Islamic Revolutionary Guards. This is a preeminent and elite force of Iranian soldiers. Were we targeting proxies, or were we targeting Iranian soldiers who were actually in Syria and Iraq?
It sounds like both, judging by the statements that came out today from the Pentagon and from the White House. Those explicitly said that they were targeting Iran's Revolutionary Guard, who are on the ground there in Syria and Iraq, advising and arming those militias, and then also the actual members of the militias, the Iraqi militias that operate in Iraq and Syria. So the answer is both. And of course, we don't know. Did they inflict serious casualties on those Revolutionary Guard Corps members? They had many days to prepare for these airstrikes. It was no mystery these were coming. The White House had telegraphed that a response was coming. They had several days to go to ground, to move, shift their resources. So I think Iran will not be shocked at what was hit today and what was struck. Now, as far as the Houthis are concerned, that may come next. I think that's something to watch. Will the next stage of this be strikes against Houthi forces in Yemen that have been firing off drones and missiles at commercial cargo ships now for weeks and causing huge problems that have now had ripples in the global economy?
Dan, thank you for your excellent reporting. I suspect you're not going to sleep a lot tonight, but we appreciate that. We'll come back to you as soon as we have other news. Dan DeLuce for us at the Pentagon. Joining us now is Ben Rhodes, who served as the Deputy National Security Advisor to President Obama. He is an MSNBC political analyst. Ben, I've been thinking all day that back when we had that, what was called the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, and a lot of people had beef about it. They thought it wasn't the best deal around. I always thought the one thing that it does do is it gets America and Iran around the same table. Something that hasn't happened, something that we haven't had in place when October 7th happened and we needed to use influence over Hamas, and something we don't have tonight.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, during that nuclear deal, it obviously put a lid on the Iranian nuclear program, framework for the U.S. and Iran to have direct discussions and try to resolve disputes and de-escalate tensions. It didn't solve every problem. I think the challenge that we're seeing here now, in addition to the fact, we haven't even mentioned the fact, Ali, that nuclear program is advanced to kind of the doorstep of the nuclear weapons capability. So that lurks in the backdrop here, too. But the other problem is just listen to the conversations we've been having, nobody's quite sure of everybody's intentions here. Right. There's the Iranian intentions. There's the intentions of the Houthis. There are the intentions of these proxy groups in Syria and Iraq. There are the intentions of Hezbollah in Lebanon. They're the intentions of Hamas. All of these groups have different motivations here, even if they are networked and connected together through the support that they receive from Iran. And the U.S. and Iran, I'm sure right now, are communicating probably largely through intermediaries, through the Chinese and the Qataris, the U.S. passing messages, telling the intermediaries, look, we have to do what we have to do to protect our people, back off, but we don't want a war with you. And the Iranians doing the same thing. The problem we've seen in the region, though, Ali, since October 7th, is everybody says they don't escalate, but it's been escalation. You know, the U.S. has now been involved with the Houthis in Yemen. Now we take these strikes. There are going to be more. The Iranian proxies have obviously taken all kinds of shots at the U.S. We see the Israeli military operation continuing kind of unabated in Gaza. That's why this feels so uncertain, because there's so many different parties, and a lot of them are not talking to each other.
Ben, to the extent that these are precision strikes, they are on what we believe to be military targets, there is always a fear when there's dry kindling of someone lighting a fire. What's the danger of a miscalculation here? What's the danger that if Iran doesn't really want to get into a war and America doesn't want to get into a war, that somehow someone's going to get us into a war?
Well, first of all, keep in mind these groups have been through war. So these are obviously powerful strikes from the U.S., but every group involved in this has been through the Iraq War. They've been through the Syrian Civil War. The Yemenis have been through a war there. What I'd be looking for is, does somebody, one of these groups, try to take another shot at the U.S. That gets through our defenses? Does Hezbollah in Lebanon decide they got to turn the dial up in terms of the rockets that they fire into Israel, and then suddenly that front, that Israeli-Hezbollah front, in flames? The U.S. did not, by the way, take a shot at Hezbollah here tonight. That's pretty careful. They're not taking a shot at Iran. They're not taking a shot at Hezbollah. It's going to be in Iraq, Syria, and probably Yemen so far. Does the Houthis, they clearly are not deterred. They're continuing to launch strikes in the Red Sea. Do they sink a ship? Any one of these things could escalate, because as we've seen, the U.S. didn't want to get involved, but when a drone got through in Jordan, we felt compelled to, because 3 of our people were killed. That shows you that sometimes an event can draw you deeper in. And again, the pattern since October 7th, so long as that war goes on in Gaza, the pattern has been there's always something that leads to a reaction.
And Ben, there have been things that have happened in the last few days as it relates to Israel and Gaza that I see as somewhat hopeful. A hopeful idea is that there was the framework of a deal worked out between the Mossad and the CIA and the Egyptians and the Qataris. It was presented to the Israelis, despite the fact that Netanyahu said no chance. The Israelis have said we probably kind of accept the framework of this deal, and Hamas has done the same thing. They've said we're considering it. There are things that we want that are not in this deal, but not everybody did what they have typically been doing in recent weeks and saying forget it, we're not even thinking about this. Is there some sense that you've got that we may be moving toward a deal to get the release of the hostages and perhaps a ceasefire, if not an outright end to this war?
I think there's definitely an effort to try to get a portion of the hostages out. The idea is clearly coalesced between a lot of different parties, Qatar and Egypt playing a key role here, between Israel and Hamas and the United States, to have a pause for a period of time and begin to get hostages out. I think what the U.S. would really prefer and like is if that pause becomes essentially a ceasefire where you can begin to explore diplomatic avenues like, what's the future of Gaza? How is Gaza going to be administered? Can the Arabs come in some kind of peacekeeping role? How is it going to be rebuilt? Can we get something moving towards a Palestinian state? The challenge is, Bibi Netanyahu has made clear he's not signing on to that. And so I think a pause would be great for hostage releases and also to get aid into Gaza where people desperately, desperately need it. The challenge, though, is if it's not permanent and then there's a resumption of the war. We saw last time, once the war resumed again, the Israeli military operation resumed again, things went back up, temperature went back in the region again. So even this probably makes it a little more complicated to get that ceasefire going because, Israel may not want to show that it's backing down in the context of regional escalation. Hamas may have Iranians saying now's not the time to stop the fight. So all this, you're playing multi-dimensional chess with a lot of actors. And to your original point about the JCPOA, diplomacy is something you do not just with your friends, you have to do with your adversaries. And we have to find ways to have channels that work in reducing tensions. If we really don't want a regional war, the only way to avoid it is to talk.
Ben, thanks as always for your analysis. We appreciate it. Ben Rhodes is a former Deputy National Security Advisor in the United States. All right, up next, we're going to continue our live coverage of these U.S. airstrikes. Also still ahead, the absolute blockbuster jobs number showing that our economy is booming, forcing even the president's rivals to admit that his economic policies are working. The chair of the White House Economic Council of Advisors, Jared Bernstein, joins us after this break. And later this hour, progressives in Texas are taking on Republicans backing the state's abortion ban, which now includes a new effort focusing on the state's all-Republican Supreme Court. The United States Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett joins me here. Stay with us. All right, we're back with more of our breaking news coverage of the U.S. launching its first attacks against Iranian-backed militant groups in Iraq and Syria in response to the deaths of 3 American service members in Jordan on Sunday. President Biden and U.S. officials making it clear that today's attacks will not be the last. Joining us now for more from Erbil, Iraq, is NBC News chief international correspondent Keir Simmons. Good morning to you, Keir. What's the situation?
Well, Ali, we're in the early hours of the morning here now in Iraq, and we're waiting to get news of exactly what was hit. We do know that it appears that there were strikes along that border between Syria and Iraq, Anbar province, for example, where this Iranian-backed militia that is accused of carrying out that attack at Tower 22 that killed those three U.S. servicemen and women was based. So we shall see. I do think, just picking up on your conversation with Ben Rhodes before the break, to extend what he was saying, he talked about three-dimensional chess. I think there is a danger this morning here that the region will see this as moving the chess pieces around the board rather than either side going for checkmate. And I say that because I think if you were an American who stopped paying attention in the mid-2000s and switched on now, you would be absolutely stunned to learn from these strikes the extent to which the US invasion of Iraq and then the Arab Spring that was celebrated in many parts of the West that led to the Syrian civil war, the extent to which that has opened the door to Iran in this region. The reach of Iran now across Syria and into and in Iraq here too. And I say all that because you mentioned the JCPOA. Of course, the criticism of the JCPOA by Israel, by countries like Saudi Arabia, is that it concentrated on the nuclear threat, but didn't look at the threat, the conventional threat from Iran against countries like Israel. And it does, these strikes, I think, clearly are sending a message to Tehran, don't kill Americans, not sending a message to Iran to change its strategy. And that's the real question. The big question for this region really is, how do you address this Iranian presence, this Iranian strategy, using its proxies to put pressure on Israel and stating that they state that they want to remove Israel and wanting to try and push America out of the region. Clearly, that's not what the Biden administration has been trying to do, and certainly I don't think that will have that impact. So the big question in this region is not addressed. It's really more of a kind of managing the crisis, really managing the situation.
I just want to ask you, Keir, quickly, because you make an interesting point. Syria is, for all intents and purposes, essentially controlled by Iran, with some outposts that are controlled by Russia. That was the deal. Russia will get a naval base on the Mediterranean, and that's it. The Syrian government exists at the mercy of the Iranians, and the Iraqi government is heavily infiltrated and fully influenced by the Iraqi government, by the Iranian government.
Yeah. That's exactly right. And that you make a very important point at the end there, because that just gives you a picture of the incredible challenges the Biden administration is trying to assess, because the Iraqi government, where I am, is a partner of the US, but it's also a partner of Iran. So if you strike too heavily in Iraq, and it looks like to me, I mean, this is a big escalation by the US, but it's also limited. They didn't hit, for example, around Damascus, where there are Iranian sites. They stayed along the border with Syria in Iraq. It seems, according to what the regional reports we're getting, so the Iraqi government is a partner of both the US and Iran. If you hit too heavily in Iraq, you actually push the government towards Iran, and you increase the calls here for the US to leave, which is exactly what Iran wants.
Yep.
Fundamentally, just to make the point again, and the American people, aren't really being asked what they want to do about Iran, whether they want a US presence here or not to face down Iran. And as long as that question really isn't being fully addressed, then the problems will continue.
Yep.
Again, there are more strikes to come, and these were substantial strikes. They will send a message to Tehran, but will it shift Tehran's strategy? I think that's a question tonight.
Keir, stay safe. Thanks for my friend, NBC News Chief International Correspondent Keir Simmons, joining us from Erbil, Iraq. Joining us now is MSNBC military analyst and retired four-star General Barry McCaffrey. Barry, good evening to you. Thank you for being with us. Your evaluation of what you understand to have taken place tonight. There has been a determination on the part of the American government to say that these are highly targeted precision strikes. Took about half an hour to get 125 munitions out there. What's your sense of what happened?
I thought Keir Simmons' reporting was really intriguing. The basic military strike is pretty well thought out. It's objective. It's constrained. It did not hit inside Iran, which is a crucial distinction. I think a wise one. It was a virtuoso performance by U.S. air power to come from, it's a 13,000-mile round trip for B-1 supersonic bombers to hit targets in the Middle East and return. It was communicating primarily, you've killed U.S. troops, stop it. As Keir mentions, it really didn't address the larger strategic issues. It didn't go after the Houthis, who are making a major damaging hit on international shipping traffic. So very moderated. It's going to continue. It did strike at IRGC operatives. That was an important signal to the Iranians. But I think it was a very moderate response. Biden and his team, experienced people, they don't want this war to widen.
I'm a bit surprised the other day when the attack happened on Tower 22 in Jordan, the American service members were killed. Guys like Lindsey Graham, who should know better because he has a military background, tweeted out to strike deep into Iran or bomb Tehran. There were a number of people who did that. That would be a very different thing.
Oh, no question. It would have been foolhardy, irresponsible. I mean, Secretary Blinken and Austin are old hands at this. What would our strategic purpose be at opening all-out war with Iran? Again, I think the Biden team very carefully thought through this. It's a start of a continuing effort, though, to communicate to the Iranians, knock off the attacks on our forces. I think it's going to open a discussion, though, inside the Biden administration. What are we doing in Iraq with 2,500 troops? What are we doing in Syria with 900 troops, 3,000 in Jordan? They do fulfill a purpose. It's a counter-ISIS mission, but our interests best served. The Iraqis denounced the strikes, this time again, carried out by American air power and their sovereign interests. So, we really got to sit down and determine what are we trying to achieve here.
The point you're making is that we are doing things that may not be welcome by the very people on whose territory we're doing it. I was very fast that Iraq came out and condemned these strikes. Keir makes the point that in Anbar province, in Iraq, they are American allies. They are also Iranian allies.
Yeah, well, we got, people up in Erbil in the north, the Kurdish presence, that were stabilizing that region to keep the Iraqi army from going back to slaughter them, supposedly Iraqi territory. We do get a great deal out of having intelligence operatives in Iraq. In Syria, we're, again, standing with our Kurdish allies in anti-ISIS campaign. But I do think there's going to have to be a sort of a blank slate reanalysis of what are we doing. A lot of this, of course, is still driven by Iranian regional attacks on U.S. Israeli interests. It's also the Shia-Sunni divide. Every one of these issues goes to Shia Iran trying to create the great arc, the crescent, up to most of these populist militias that they're supporting are Shia elements, to include the Houthis. So there's larger issues here than counter-ISIS, a Sunni terrorist organization, which is a threat to the plurality of Iraq, which is Shia Muslim.
A lot to think about, sir. Thank you, as always, for being with us, the military analyst, General Barry McCaffrey. We appreciate your time.